In 2002, a young heavyweight shocked the world by becoming the UFC's youngest champion ever. But just months later, he was stripped of his title and banned from the promotion. What followed would change the landscape of MMA forever, as an entire nation embraced the man that America had cast aside. This fighter went on to define an entire era in the Japanese MMA circuit, delivering iconic battles regularly. Yet to many UFC fans, he remained a pariah, branded a cheat and a fraud. At just 24 years old, this scrappy yet highly technical fighter dethroned the legendary Randy Couture to claim the UFC heavyweight title. But his reign was short-lived, leading to an exile unlike any other in MMA history. And no, we're not talking about Paul Daly, who was also ousted from the UFC for an illegal punch after the bell. And no, we're not talking about Gegard Mousasi, who left out of sheer frustration. And no, this isn't the story of Francis Ngannou, who walked away to carve his own path. This is the story of a man who paved the way for fighters like them. Proof that even if the UFC fires and bans you outright, you can still make millions and achieve legendary status beyond its walls. We are of course talking about the War Master, formerly known as the baby-faced assassin, Josh Barnett. To truly understand what happened, let's rewind to where it all began. Josh Barnett grew up in Seattle, Washington, loving pro wrestling, metal music, and nerding out over fantasy stories. So he was more likely to be rolling dice in Dungeons & Dragons than throwing punches in a boxing gym. He was a nerd through and through. But then he discovered catch wrestling, and everything changed. Catch wrestling is like the love child of submission grappling and pro wrestling. It's raw, gritty, and unapologetically violent. And for a young Josh Barnett, it felt like destiny. He loved pro wrestling, and tying it in with submissions art made it the perfect sport for the young upstart. He trained obsessively, learning techniques passed down from legendary grapplers like Billy Robinson. By the time he hit his early 20s, Barnett was a wrecking ball of a grappler. Every grappler, sooner or later, dabbles in MMA at some point. Barnett did too. In 1997, he made his MMA debut, and let me tell you, it was a sight to behold. This was a 6'3", 250-pound kid who fought like a lightweight. He was throwing bombs like most heavyweights, but what made him stand out from the sluggers of that time was his intricate grappling. He would tie in chain wrestling and submissions together, breaking opponents mentally and physically. He made his UFC debut just 3 years after his MMA debut in 2000 with a 9-0 undefeated record. But how did Barnett even get to the UFC in the first place? After building his name on the regional circuit, he caught the attention of UFC matchmakers, particularly after a dominant run in organizations like Super Brawl. Now in the UFC, Barnett wasted no time making an impression. His first fight was against Gan McGee, a massive heavyweight with serious power. Barnett made quick work of McGee and knocked him out with a series of brutal punches. Then came bigger tests, ones that Barnett would pass with flying colors. Barnett would go on to beat Bobby Hoffman, a tough-as-nails journeyman, and Sammy Schilt, a 6'11" kickboxing monster. But of course, being a relative newcomer to the sport, Barnett was not invincible. In 2001, he faced off against Pedro Rizzo, a heavy-handed Brazilian who would hand Barnett his first loss. That too by knockout, as Barnett would be knocked out cold in the second round. For many fighters, such a devastating KO loss would be hard to bounce back from, but not for Barnett. He came back stronger, tearing through the competition and earning a title shot against Randy Couture in 2002. The fight against Couture was Barnett's time to shine, and boy did he ever. At the time, Couture was the epitome of what a champion should be. He was disciplined, tactical, and respected by everyone in the sport. Barnett, on the other hand, was the brash young upstart. The odds were not exactly in his favor. To put this into perspective, in today's UFC, it would be like pitting Raul Rosas Jr. or Paddy Pimblett against legends like Max Holloway and Alexander Volkanovski straight out of the gate. Still, Barnett was not intimidated. From the opening bell, he pressured Couture, forcing the champ into uncomfortable position. The fight went to the ground. Barnett's whirled, and well, that's where it ended. Using his ground and pound, Barnett broke Couture down and finished him in the second round. And just like that, Josh Barnett won the UFC Heavyweight Championship, and he beat a living legend while doing it.
I was the youngest I still am the youngest UFC heavyweight champion of all time.
Sweet.
But when I beat Couture, I was the youngest UFC champion of all time.
Wow.
And that stayed until John Jones. Yeah, so now he's the youngest UFC champion, and I'm still the youngest UFC heavyweight champion of all time.
And then everything fell apart. After the fight, Barnett tested positive for anabolic steroids. Not just one, but 3 different banned substances. Boldenone, nandrolone, and fluoxymesterone were all found in his system. The UFC acted quickly, stripping him of the title and essentially blacklisting him from the promotion. It was a scandal that rocked the MMA world. This is even unheard of today. A newly crowned champion not just getting stripped of his title, but being outright banned from the promotion. Even though Barnett denied knowingly using steroids, the damage had been done. Fans turned on him, and the UFC wanted nothing to do with him. For a moment, it looked like his career might be over. But as we know, Josh Barnett is not the kind of guy to throw in the towel. He saw an opportunity where others saw failure, and that opportunity for him was in Japan. To get an idea of why Josh Barnett's career thrived in Japan after being downright banned in the UFC, you need to understand the stark differences between American and Japanese MMA cultures in the early 2000s. The UFC under Dana White was working hard to legitimize itself. The days of human cockfighting were almost over, and the promotion wanted to project an image of professionalism. That meant strict rules, rigorous drug testing, and an emphasis on marketable, clean-cut fighters. Barnett's steroid use, even if they were just allegations, strictly went against this policy, and he had to be cut. Now, Japan, on the other hand, had a very different approach. Promotions like Pride FC were all about the spectacle. Fighters were treated like larger-than-life warriors, and the focus was on entertainment as much as competition. Interestingly, unlike the UFC, Pride did not enforce USADA-style drug testing. In fact, former Pride executive Nobuyuki Sakaakibara admitted in interviews that fighters were not tested at all. And it's not like they were paying bad money either. In fact, at the time, Pride had a better heavyweight roster than the UFC because of its higher fighter pay. All of this and more made Pride the perfect fit for Barnett. After being banned by the UFC in 2002, Barnett would compete in independent promotions like Pancrase and King of the Cage before making his debut in Pride in 2004. When Barnett made his debut, fans didn't know what to expect. Would he be the same fighter who dominated in the UFC, or would all the scandals weigh him down? The concerns were justified when he would lose his first 2 fights in the promotion, both of which against Mirko Cro Cop. However, even in defeat, his fighting style and heart would win the heart of the fan. Then, he started on a win streak. His first win in Pride was against Kazuhiro Nakamura. Barnett dominated the fight with his catch wrestling skills, finishing Nakamura with a nasty-looking armbar. Barnett had won over the Pride fans. He wasn't just another foreigner trying to cash in on Japan's MMA scene. He respected the culture, embraced the showmanship, and connected with fans on a deeper level. Whether it was his pro wrestling-inspired entrances or his candid interviews, Barnett knew how to put on a show. And it wasn't like Barnett was fighting lesser, easier competition. If you were an MMA fan in the mid-2000s, you know that Pride's heavyweight division was no joke. Fedor Emelianenko, Mirko Cro Cop, Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira, those were just some of the scariest fighters on the planet. And Josh Barnett jumped right into the mix. Over the years, he had some absolute wars in Pride, including his legendary trilogy with Nogueira. Every fight was a chess match, with Barnett's catch wrestling going up against Nogueira's Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Barnett didn't just stop at MMA. Like I mentioned earlier, Barnett grew up a pro wrestling fan, so it was only natural for him to become a major player in Japan's pro wrestling scene, working with promotions like New Japan Pro Wrestling and Inoki Genome Federation. Barnett saw pro wrestling as an extension of his MMA career, a way to entertain fans while showcasing his love for grappling and storytelling. But the question remains, why did Barnett thrive so much in Japan? Why did Japan love a fighter that the UFC had banned? The answer lies in his love for Japan and its culture. For starters, he embraced Japanese traditions in a way that few foreign fighters did. He didn't just show up to collect paychecks. He immersed himself in the country's history, its martial arts ethos, and even its entertainment culture. Unlike some fighters who saw Japan as a last resort after being cut from the UFC, Barnett treated it like home. One of the most striking things about Barnett was how much he resonated with the samurai spirit. Japan has always revered fighters who embody the Bushido code: honor, loyalty, and courage in the face of adversity. Barnett fit that mold perfectly. He was a warrior, and Japanese fans respected that. Just look at how adored Yuri Prochazka is. Even though he is from the Czech Republic, he had a lengthy run in Rizin, and his warrior spirit made him a fan favorite, not just in Japan, but the entire world. Then there is the pro wrestling factor. While MMA fans in the West often look down on pro wrestling, in Japan the two worlds have always been closely linked. Pride's roots were intertwined with pro wrestling, and many of its biggest stars, Kazushi Sakuraba, Antonio Inoki, and even Fedor Emelianenko, had ties to wrestling. Barnett, being a self-proclaimed wrestling nerd, leaned into this crossover like no other. His knowledge of classic wrestling techniques and his love for storytelling made him a natural fit for the Japanese wrestling scene. Fans loved watching him transition seamlessly between legitimate MMA fights and scripted wrestling matches, often even masterfully blurring the line between the two. And let's not forget his showmanship. Barnett's entrances were pure theater. Think pro wrestling meets heavy metal. He'd walk out to the ring with an intensity that screamed, "I'm here to fight, but I'm also here to entertain." It was the kind of spectacle that Pride fans lived for.
That shit used to give me goosebumps.
Yes, exactly. When you'd hear those drums kick in and they'd drop that curtain from front of everyone, ba-boom, and stuff would go off, and it's like, Pride Friday Championship.
Barnett's passion for pro wrestling didn't end with Pride. Inspired by Japan's hybrid of wrestling and MMA, Barnett created his own wrestling promotion, Josh Barnett's Bloodsport. Now, unlike traditional pro wrestling events, Bloodsport is a hybrid of professional wrestling and MMA, emphasizing hard-hitting, realistic fights with no ropes and no scripted finishes. Inspired by the raw, shoot-style wrestling of Japan's UWFI and Pancrase, Bloodsport showcased matches that feel like real fights, where victory is achieved only by knockout or submission.
Like, what the fuck you got me into with this Bloodsport shit? I had no idea. You asked me, like, anything you asked me, I'm like, okay, yeah, I want to see you again. I want to hang out with you and stuff like this. It's been years. I said, okay.
In Japan at that?
In Japan at that. And then I'm seeing my opponent, and he looked like a motherfucking Japanese Neanderthal. Mm-hmm. What the fuck you got me into?
Only the best and most considered, the thing that I think you need most in your life, and that is to be sweated upon.
Since its inception, Bloodsport has featured top-tier MMA fighters and wrestlers alike, including Jon Moxley, Minoru Suzuki, Shayna Baszler, and even former UFC fighters like Frank Mir. The event has become a cult favorite among hardcore combat sports fans, bridging the gap between the worlds of wrestling and MMA in a way that few promotions ever have. One other reason for his fanfare is that some of Barnett's most iconic MMA moments came in Pride. Take, for instance, his classic trilogy against Mirko Cro Cop from 2004 to 2006. They were all brutal affairs, and even though Barnett lost all three of the fights, his toughness won many fans over. MMA is a strange sport. Some lose fans while winning, while others raise their stocks even with devastating losses. Going toe-to-toe with a murderer like Mirko 3 times would make the fans respect you, that's for sure.
Talk to me about Pride and Cro Cop 3 times. I want to know, was he a hard puzzle to figure out?
The hardest puzzle about it, I mean, at any given point towards the top of his career, he was top of the food chain, going to be a tough fight for anyone, just about. Unless you're Kevin Randleman. I mean, it'd be something to see him repeat it, right?
Yeah, he did. He got the rematch.
I
would have never rematched if I was Kevin.
Now, it was a brutal back-and-forth battle that showcased Barnett's toughness and technical skill. Cro Cop was one of the most feared strikers in MMA history, and while Barnett ultimately lost the fight, he gained even more respect from fans for his willingness to go toe-to-toe with a killer like Mirko. Then there were his battles with Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira. Both of their fights are the stuff of MMA legend, with each fight being a masterclass in grappling. Barnett's ability to hang with Nogueira on the ground, arguably the best heavyweight grappler of his era, cemented his place as one of the top heavyweights in the world. So, why did Japan fall head over heels for Barnett while the UFC was quick to turn its back on him? It boils down to cultural differences. In Japan, the emphasis was on the spirit of the fight, rather than an athlete's personal flaws. Barnett's catch wrestling style, his love for pro wrestling, and his ability to perform under pressure aligned perfectly with the values of Japanese MMA fans. They didn't see him as a tainted fighter. They saw him as a warrior with a complex human story. The UFC, on the other hand, was going through an identity shift in the early 2000s. Dana White was working hard to legitimize the sport. The days of human cockfighting were almost over, and the UFC wanted to project an image of professionalism. That meant strict rules, rigorous drug testing, and marketable clean-cut fighters. Barnett's steroid scandal, even if he denied knowingly taking anything, was a PR nightmare for the UFC. Simply put, in America, he was seen as a liability. In Japan, he was a superstar. Now let's not ignore the elephant in the room, drug testing. In Pride, the rules around performance-enhancing drugs were, let's say, flexible. Fighters were openly told they would not be tested, and the focus was on putting on exciting fights, not enforcing a moral code. Now, while that might seem controversial, it worked in Pride's favor. Fans didn't care if fighters were juiced to the gills, as long as the fights delivered. And boy, did they deliver. This leniency gave Barnett a chance to shine without the shadow of his past haunting him. Instead of being labeled a cheater, he was judged purely on his performance. And those performances were nothing short of legendary. The ironic thing is, it's like Barnett has two different legacies in the sport. His run in Pride solidified his legacy as one of the greatest heavyweights of his era. He was a fighter, an entertainer, a cultural icon, and a bridge between MMA and pro wrestling. Whether it was his wars with Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira, his epic clashes with Mirko Cro Cop, or his dominance in the grappling heavy bouts that showcase his catch wrestling mastery, Barnett gave Japanese fans everything they could hope for in a fighter. Even after Pride folded, Barnett competed in Sengoku, Dream, and NJPW, proving his lasting appeal. He also became a commentator, sharing his deep knowledge of the sport with fans, and proving that his love for MMA went beyond just stepping into the ring. That is his legacy in Japan. This is his legacy in the UFC. When the UFC bought out both Pride and Strikeforce, it was only a matter of time before Barnett would make his return to the UFC.
You had two different stints within the UFC. Did you see a big difference within those? Like, did you see the difference between your first and your second stint?
Oh yeah, big
because you had a big gap in between there. Mm-hmm. What was the difference for you from the first to second?
Well, for one, by the second go around with the UFC, different kind of company, amount of eyeballs, and the pay, everything was completely changed. You know, this was all post The Ultimate Fighter, and when I left the UFC originally, Pride was the place to be. That was the biggest show, and it's the biggest MMA shows. Are still Pride. Like nobody's surpassed that yet. Then I went to Strikeforce, Affliction, and Sengoku. You know, I wanted to do my thing my way, but eventually it led me back to the UFC. The striking element, it's like kickboxing with some wrestling, has kind of become the thing.
And in 2013, it actually happened. He came back. But his run was marred by inconsistent performances and once again drug testing issues. While he had some memorable fights, including a brutal victory over Frank Mir and a hard-fought war with Andrei Arlovsky, he never regained the momentum he had in his early career. For many American fans, if you asked them about Barnett, they'd remember him as the fighter who got stripped of his championship a few days after winning it. But if you ask Japanese fans, they remember him as a warrior, an entertainer, and one of the last true samurai of MMA. If you look at Barnett today, his career can be viewed through a dual lens. On one hand, he is seen as one of the most skilled and innovative heavyweights of all time, a pioneer of catch wrestling and MMA, and a fighter who brought excitement to every bout. On the other hand, his career is a cautionary tale about the impact of controversies and how they can overshadow even the most impressive achievements. Despite the ups and downs, there is no denying that Barnett left his mark on the sport. He paved the way for fighters who were cut from the UFC and were told they'd be nothing without the biggest promotion in the world backing them up.